When's it time to finally ditch your mirrorless or DSLR camera and upgrade to a professional cinema camera? Let's break it down. I've made a ton of videos on this channel showing you how to take a small mirrorless camera and fully rig it out into a cinema camera. But a lot of you guys left comments asking me, why would you spend all that money rigging out this little camera when you could just buy a full-on cinema camera? Well, I'm going to answer that question and unpack a whole bunch of other details in this video. This will not be a direct comparison of the Sony a7S image quality versus the Sony FS5. It's really going to be more of a comparison of mirrorless cameras versus professional cinema cameras, their form factor and features. So what makes a camera a cinema camera? Well, I think a lot of that comes down to the manufacturer and their marketing lingo. Sony calls this a professional camcorder, but something similar to this, like the Canon C200, they call a digital cinema camera or cinema camcorder. And if you look at the Ursa Mini, they call it a professional digital film camera. And then of course you have the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K and 6K, which look a lot more like a DSLR. So you can see how the term cinema camera gets thrown all across the board, but for our purposes today, we're considering it any camera that's built just for video and not photography, and it has more professional inputs and outputs. All right, we've defined our terms. Let's get into the real side-by-side comparison of these two different types of cameras now. First up is form factor and ergonomics. When it comes to a professional camera like this, most of them break down into a few similar parts. For example, you have the top handle, which is easily removable without any tools, and you just slide it off. Then you have, most of the time, a monitor or little LCD screen that can also be removed from the top handle and placed anywhere that you want to on your rig. Then you have your side handle or grip that you can also remove if you need to. So you can see just how different these two bodies are already. This is a lot easier to mount on a gimbal because it's so light and small. It's really easy to balance on a simple single-handed gimbal like the Ronin S. Whereas this, yes, I have balanced it on the Ronin S a handful of times, but it's a total pain in the butt to do. It has to be completely stripped down, which means I have to use an external monitor somewhere else mounted. So if you're gonna use a cinema camera, you gotta realize that you're gonna have to buy a much larger gimbal like the Movi Pro or the Ronin 2. I think both of these types of cameras are great for doing handheld footage. Of course, this is gonna be a lot lighter and easier to use all day, but you're gonna get much more micro jitters because it's so small and light. The sensor is going to be much more affected. Whereas when you're doing handheld with this, you're really not getting all those little micro jitters like you get with a DSLR. It's much more steady and weighted and everything like that. I want to talk about how easy this is to break down and throw into a Pelican. And then once you get on site to your shoot, you can quickly assemble it all back together without any tools, which is fantastic. Whereas when I completely rig out my DSLR camera or mirrorless camera, usually I have to use a lot of little Allen keys and different tools to break it down and take it all apart. And we all know that time is money when you're on set, so you want to be able to quickly rig out your camera and get shooting right away. And of course it has all the buttons on top that you really need to have a successful shoot. You have your start and stop button, so you can hit that and start recording without coming down to wherever the record button is on the camera. And it has a wide and telephoto rocker. So if you're using a lens like this one that is a zoom lens, the 18-105, and you want to get closer in on the shot, you don't have to really do anything. You just push forward on the button or zoom out. You can of course grip it from the side here. And it's nice that it's really secure in your hand with this little strap. And then you have the same buttons and even more on the side handle. You have, of course, the record button again that you can quickly access there to start and stop rolling. And then you have your rocker to zoom in and out on your lens. And then you have a couple other buttons where, of course, if you want to do something similar with a mirrorless camera, you can rig it out like I've shown you before, put a side handle on there, but most side handles don't have start and stop record buttons. Let's move on to what I think is one of the biggest differences between cinema cameras and mirrorless cameras, and that is in and out ports. So on a camera like this or professional camcorder, it usually has a full-size HDMI port, which is huge because the full-size HDMI port is so much more secure than a micro HDMI port like you have on the Sony Alpha cameras. You're always going to be struggling with this teeny tiny micro HDMI cable. And honestly, this is one of the worst connections in the world. But even better than the HDMI port, in my opinion, is the SDI port. I love SDI. You gotta be a freaking camera nerd to say you love SDI, right? So the SDI cable, if you're not familiar, looks a lot like a coax cable that plugs in for your internet, but it's not quite the same thing. All of them have a nice metal tip connection on them and then a spinning locking mechanism. So you can plug it into the back here and then you just lock it into place. Once it's locked into place, this is going nowhere. You could try and tear this out. I don't recommend it because you don't want to ruin your port, but it's really not going to come out. Another great thing about SDI is that video and audio can run over an SDI cable for hundreds of feet. We film a lot of live events and we'll run SDI cables up to 250 feet away from our cameras, all the way in the front to our computers in the back where we're streaming and recording the footage. Also, when we're filming live news, we have to use an SDI cable to get to the server, which gets it to the satellite and the rest of the world. You can of course plug in the HDMI and SDI at the same time, and you still get video signal to your LCD as well. Whereas on a mirrorless camera, they really only have that one output. So on most of them, you'll have at least one XLR input, if not two, which we have another one here in the back. So this is extremely nice to have because very frequently you're interviewing two people and you can mic up both of them with a professional mic or boom mic and then just plug the XLR cable directly into your camera. So on most of these little mirrorless cameras, they just have a spot for 3.5 millimeters. Of course, there are adapters that can take an XLR down to a 3.5 millimeter, but then you have to deal with those extra adapters and you still only have one input on most of these cameras. Now, with most of these professional cameras, it usually comes with a spot to mount a shotgun microphone. So I have the Rode NTG2 and I can just slide that into place and then of course plug the XLR cable right into the back here. Obviously this XLR cable is way too long for this. Usually I'll use a 1 or 2 foot XLR cable. You have gain settings on the outside of your camera right here. Now this is typical on most cameras like this where you have a little gain setting here. This goes from 0 to 10, which is so fantastic that you can manually change those gain settings and watch your levels on the LCD and of course listen back and make those fine adjustments. I'll find that when we're interviewing someone, sometimes they'll get really soft, and so I'll just gently boost up the gain. Or they'll get really excited and loud, and I'll be like, oh, bring it back down, bring it back down. So it's really nice to be able to quickly make those adjustments and not have to go in through all the menus. You can just make them all on the fly right here. There's no buttons or knobs on here for changing your gain. You have to go through the menus and it won't let you change it while you're in the middle of recording. You really have to keep it set where it's at. And the preamps inside of these small mirrorless cameras are pretty terrible anyways. Most cameras like these also have dual memory card slots. So on this one, it uses SD cards. So I can throw in 2 SD cards into this and know that once one runs out, it'll roll right into the next one. Whereas on most small mirrorless cameras, you only have 1 slot for an SD card. And there are some cameras that are getting dual card slots, which I'm so grateful that they're starting to put in. But a lot of the smaller, more cheaper ones still only have 1 card slot. Most cameras like this have a battery slot in the back where you can quickly pop in and out the battery. Now the beauty of having it on the back like that, as you saw, is I can just slide it right out. I don't have to remove it from the tripod, open the door and pull the battery out. Whereas on a mirrorless camera like this, almost every tripod that I use this on, I have to remove the camera from the tripod because the battery door won't open. It gets in the way and I can't get the battery out. And then you have these teeny tiny batteries that last 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes. Of course, it depends on the mirrorless camera that you're using, but most of the time they don't even last an hour. Something like this will last me 5 hours, sometimes longer. It just depends on if we're continually recording or not. And of course, it has that nice button on the back, an LED so I can see how much battery life is left. Of course, there are other ways to power a small camera like this, like using a V-mount battery, and I've shown you guys in many previous videos how to do that, but of course it requires a lot of rigging up and can be pretty bulky. One of my favorite parts about using a professional camera is the fact that most of them have ND filters built in, and they're really easy to turn on. So if I'm shooting out in bright sunlight and I want to maintain a shallow depth of field, I can just spin this wheel to 1, 2, or 3, and that will give me some nice variability in my ND filters. Whereas with something like this, as you know, you got to use some sort of option to get NDs on the front of your lens. So typically I will use something like this screw-on variable ND filter from Tiffin. And of course this works, but as soon as I do a lens swap, I gotta swap this over as well. Or if I have my camera fully rigged out, I can of course use ND filters inside of my matte box. A huge difference between a professional video camera and a mirrorless camera are all the myriad of buttons on these. At first, when you see this, you might be a little bit overwhelmed, but as soon as you learn all the different buttons on your cinema camera, it makes it so much quicker to change your settings, like ISO, white balance, and shutter speed. Now, on this camera, there are 3 different settings, so you can go in and customize what you want them to be, but you have low, medium, and high. Whereas with a mirrorless camera, sometimes you just have to spin through it if you have a wheel set up to change ISO, or you actually have to dive into your menu settings and change your ISO up or down, which can just take forever. Like I said, most of them have custom buttons for white balance as well. So this has an A, a B, and a preset. So I might set A to 3200 Kelvin for indoors, and then B to 5600 Kelvin for outdoor shooting. Now, the nice thing about this particular LCD is that you can of course flip it around, and there's a button that can quickly rotate the screen around for you. You don't have to go through the menus to change its orientation. And then of course it's fully adjustable. You can spin it around any which way that you need to when you're out filming. Whereas with this, you're pretty limited. You can tilt it, you can tilt it some more, or you can tilt it back in. That's about it. At the beginning of this video, I posed the question whether or not you should invest your money in building a small mirrorless camera into a cinema rig, or if you should just save up and get a professional cinema camera. Well, I think that solely depends on you and your circumstances and what you want to do with the camera. If you have a mirrorless camera already and you love the image quality coming out of it, but you want a little bit more features and ergonomics, well, maybe it's time to start buying some rails and a side handle and a top handle and just build out your camera a little bit and see how you like it. But let's say that you do a lot of documentary work and live events and live streaming. Maybe you should save up for a more professional camera that's gonna have those more professional inputs and outputs. Now, do I think you need something like this for filming YouTube videos? No, not at all. And if you're doing a lot of travel films and vlogging and things like that, this is definitely not the right camera for you, in my opinion. You wanna stick to something smaller and lighter like this that you can quickly throw in and out of a backpack, get the shot, take your photos. Guys, leave a comment below. Would you rather rig out a mirrorless camera into a cinema camera, or save up and invest in an actual cinema camera? Tell me what you think. And if you want to see more videos like this, I have other cinema cameras that I can review, and we can talk about them in way more detail. So definitely let me know, and hit subscribe right now, because I have a ton more videos coming out just in general on shooting, editing, lighting, everything like that. All right, I'll see you in the next video.